So one of the decisions that a lot of private practice owners need to make is whether or not they want to accept or insurance or be on insurance panels. And a lot of that decision depends on the demographics of your area and what you feel like your clients need. And if you do decide to go onto insurance panels or maybe just thinking about it, one of the ways to do that is to talk to the folks at Practice Solutions. They are absolutely the experts in insurance billing and credentialing, and they do all the hard work for you. They're who I use in my practice. So go check them out today, and you can find out about them by going to practicesol.com/Gordon. And talk to Jeremy and his team, and they'll help you out in navigating the whole insurance piece and help you take the headaches out of it. This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, helping you to navigate your private practice journey. This is session number 78 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, folks. I'm Gordon Brewer, and welcome to the podcast. If this is the first time for you to listen to the podcast, welcome. And I am so excited about this particular episode. I've got a wonderful guest today, and a lot of you out there that listen to podcasts probably know this guy already. The one and only Melvin Varghese is here with me today on the podcast, and I'm been so happy to get to know Melvin over these last few weeks. He was gracious enough to invite me to be on the Selling the Couch podcast, which if you'll go to the Facebook page or Twitter or Instagram, any of my social media spots, you can get links to that and check out that episode, because I talk with Melvin about G Suite and just some of the hacks and that sort of thing around all of that. For many of you, you might know or may not know that I put together a course called G Suite for Therapists, and it's still available, and I'll be sure to have links in the show summary here for today's show as well. But it's a course I did last year, and it just walks therapists through all the different tools of G Suite and how you can use them for your practice, and also make it HIPAA secure, which is a huge benefit for using the tools of G Suite. And so in that episode with Melvin Selling the Couch, I got to talk with him about that. But he returned the favor, and so he's here with me today on this particular episode. So I'm glad Melvin is joining me today. A few things I wanted to let you know about. As I mentioned in the last episodes, and I promise you this is probably the last of the pre-launch that you're going to hear much about of the Money Matters in Private Practice course. You can still get it at half price, so take advantage of that while you can, because by getting it at half price now means you'll have access to everything once it's all up and on the platform. There's already probably close to 90% of it up there. If all goes well, I've got my fingers crossed, you can't see it, but I'll have the course, all of the content of the course up and loaded by the time this episode comes out. I hope that's true. Just as they say, God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll get it all out there. As I've shared with many of you, my life's just been crazy over the last few months. My wife fell and broke her ankle, and then having to deal with getting my dad into assisted living and all of that. So all of the projects I'd been working on for the practice of therapy just kind of took a back burner. And so I don't like doing it that way. I usually like to stay much more organized than that. But as we all know, life happens. So anyway, just wanted to let you know about that. And also be sure to check out today's sponsor for the podcast, Practice Solutions. And they are who I use for my medical billing, and got So check them out. They do a great job for me, and they're very reasonably priced too. So anyway, check them out over at practicesol.com/Gordon. They're wonderful folks to deal with. So, well, without further ado, here is the one and only Dr. Melvin Varghese. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Practice of Therapy podcast. And this has been, I've been looking forward to this day just ever since I met Melvin about a couple of weeks ago. And for those of you that don't know Melvin Varghese, you've been hiding your head in the sand, especially if you listen to podcasts. And Melvin, I'm so happy to have you on the podcast and finally able to connect with you. Melvin has Selling the Couch podcast, which is ranks up there in the top. Well, it was number one there for a while, but great podcast. And I listened to Melvin, and we have just really hit it off. And I'm just so thrilled to have you, Melvin, on the podcast.
Gordon, it's amazing how, we are in two different parts of the country, although we do have the Tennessee connection, but it's amazing that podcasting has brought us together. And I'm just so grateful to be here and be a guest on the show.
Yes, and I'm honored to have you, really. So, Melvin, as I usually start with most folks, tell folks a little bit about your journey and just how you've landed where you are, not only as as a psychologist, but just as we were talking about ahead of time, just all the things that have come together for you in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I became fully licensed as a psychologist in 2012. I had completed grad school, done an internship and postdoc, grad school in Texas, and then internship and postdoc in Nashville. And I had gotten married right at the end of my postdoc year, and we were trying to decide whether to move back to Texas, to stay in Nashville, to move to Philadelphia, where my wife is. And we ultimately decided to move to Philadelphia. I never, in my wildest dreams, growing up down south, I never imagined I'd live in the Northeast. But it's been a journey, and I really am grateful to be here. As I mentioned, I got licensed in 2012, and so when we moved here to Philadelphia, prior to that, I had worked in community practicums and things like that in community mental health, and also primarily in university counseling centers, also done some work at the VA as well. So I imagined actually working at a university counseling center or doing some kind of private practice. And I ended up starting in a group practice when I came here to Philadelphia, and then also was doing some testing and assessment at a community mental health agency. And my dream was always to be in a solo practice. I didn't imagine myself being a group practice owner, but I remember I always had that dream, and yet I had this realization that I didn't have the business background to be able to know how to run a business. And so I remember it was me and two of my friends in the group practice. What we would do is we would meet once a month, and we would usually just hang out and talk about sort of the business side of things, and then we would grab a meal. And those conversations they led me to starting Selling the Couch. I just had this realization, man, if we're having these conversations about what it takes to build a practice and figuring out things like marketing and social media, maybe other people need that information too. And so that's what made me start Selling the Couch. And since then, recently, I took a break for several years to kind of launch Selling the Couch, develop it, and then now I've kind of jumped back into a small private practice where I primarily work with folks that are in leadership positions, entrepreneurs, and but my main gig is Selling the Couch. So
yeah, and it's a podcast that I started listening to early on when I was at that phase of, okay, I really need to up my game in terms of I was making that transition from really working part-time in my private practice to moving more full-time. And And also, I think I shared with you before, Melvin, that you were one of the people that inspired me to really start this podcast when
Mm.
I started the practice of therapy. And I was thinking, well, gosh, I listen to a lot of podcasts. There's probably a lot of other people out there that are listening to podcasts as well, which is very true. And so, yeah, so a question for you is that what was it that really kind of inspired you to start the podcast, and what was that like? And I guess another question that you can kind of piggyback on there is, and I know this is something that's really an area of expertise for you, is getting therapists to start their own podcasts as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are good questions. So I think what made me start like a podcast versus going into another medium is a couple of things. One, I think it was personality based. I'm naturally an INFJ on my Myers-Briggs, so the
Uh-huh.
thought of I've gotten better at video and things like that, but I love the thought of doing an audio podcast, just because I don't have to be all dressed up, and I felt like with video again, I can do it, but it drains me in a weird way, that in a
Mm-hmm.
way that audio doesn't. And so that was one. And then the second reason I started a podcast is just because podcasting is such a new medium. And the more I was reading about it and the more I was starting to look at these trends, I was realizing, there's so much, like, we're really at the tip of the iceberg in terms of podcast. Even like, statistically, I mean, it's grown now. I think last few years ago, I'm trying to go off my head, but I would say somewhere around 40% of the US population was listening to podcasts. And this past year, it's now 51%. It's the
Wow.
first time that half of the US population is now listening to podcasts, which is pretty amazing that, even 7, 8 years ago, if you asked people what a podcast was, they would be like, what in the world,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I was trying to recall this morning when I first started listening to podcasts, and it was probably around 2010, 2011. So that was really early on. And when was it that you started selling the couch? What year was that?
Yes, I started my first episode was in February of 2015, but the
Okay.
idea came probably the previous August, and I sat on the idea for about 5 months because, well, just to be completely honest, I was terrified of starting a podcast.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I didn't know, I didn't, naturally I'm a little bit more shy, so the thought of being so public was terrifying. And then I
Mhm.
also struggled with, well, who am I to create something like this and
Right, right.
put something out into the world? And it took a lot of courage. And I think ultimately what I just realized is I didn't want to live a life of regret. And I didn't want to look at my life and be like, what if I had done this?
Yeah, right. Oh, that's great. I love that. Love that. Yeah. So you've obviously learned a lot about not only private practice, but podcasting and all of that. What would you say? I'm going to put you on the spot a little here. What are some of the highlights for you over the last few years doing all of this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, definitely like just some of the insights that I've learned from. So, on the podcast, what I typically do is I do solo episodes where I kind of share what I've learned along the way. And then I
Hmm.
interview clinicians that are successful private practitioners about how they're
Hmm.
building their practices. And so, just in the world of private practice building, I would say a couple of things. One is there's no like one size fits all when it comes to private practice, because ultimately you have to weigh what's happening in your like family life and your private life, and you
Hmm.
have to figure out what private practice is going to look like, right? So for some people it may mean being on insurance panels. For others it may mean a solo private pay practice. For others it may mean a group practice. And so I think one thing I realized is, initially I was like, I need to do it this way. And I realized there's just people are doing all sorts of different ways, and it's
Hmm.
okay to,
Right.
to own where you are. So,
Right. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. I think that's so true. And that's what I've learned. you can get a lot of advice and a lot of direction from people. Oh, this is the way to do it. But I think you ultimately just have to find your own, what fits for you.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's that what fits for you, that's what's enables us to keep going, because
Hmm.
the reality is the day-to-day of building a business, it's got its ups and downs, and
Yeah.
so if you don't if all you're focused on is income, for example, it's not a long-term sustaining thing because your
Hmm.
emotion, at least for me, for a long time, I focused just on income, and all my emotions just went up and down, and it was completely related to income,
Hmm.
And I think when I shifted that to a deeper purpose, uh, that's
Yeah.
when I think it shifted for me. So,
Right. Right. Yeah. I think I saw, I was, snooping around on one of your websites earlier, and there was something you said there that really struck a chord with me, is that, direct, I'm going to misquote you, but you'll probably remember what it is. Um, a lot of action and doing without purpose really leads to burnout.
mhm.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I'm constantly learning and figuring out for myself as well.
Yeah, I mean, and related to this, we were talking about this right before we got started, which is, if all you do is like focus on income generation, um, it's not it's not like what you said, it's not sustainable, right?
Hmm.
In the long term, you are inevitably going to burn out, or you just realize, especially I think for our field, especially many of us that are called into private practice, we have this deep calling to serve a population or a niche
Hmm.
or a specialization in some kind of way,
Hmm. Hmm.
and yeah, and we all of us want to be doing this for a long time. So
Right, right. Yeah, and I think I think as you talked about, is just figuring out your lifestyle and making sure that your practice fits your lifestyle. I've shared with some of my audience just kind of the the things that life has handed us here lately. I've had, my wife broke her ankle, and so I've had to drastically change my routine every day and to help her out. And then I had an uncle to die, and then my dad has moved. We had to move him into assisted living, and the blessing in all of that for me is that I have the freedom in my practice to be able to arrange things so that I can go attend to those things that matter most.
mm,
And I think that's a huge thing. Um,
yeah. Well, I
yeah.
mean, and to that point, Gordon, I think for me, again, I'm like slowly learning this, but I think beyond when, as a business owner, when you get beyond a certain level of income, what what I've realized is the time flexibility and
Hmm.
creating a lifestyle that makes sense. That's the more important thing.
Right, right. Yeah, I heard a statistic somewhere, I can't remember where, that at least in the United States, and I'm sure it's comparable across the rest of the world, but when a person reaches kind of a net income of around $150,000, which is a pretty good income for most
Mm,
people. Once it goes above that, then it just gets wieldy and almost unmanageable in
yeah.
terms of, I mean, their quality of life doesn't increase any once it
Yeah.
goes above that. Yeah.
Right. In fact, I could see the other side of it. Like it actually
Yeah.
becomes more stressful because you fear losing,
Right.
right, what you have.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, another thing too that we had talked about, and I know that, yeah, it's what's amazing is how we have the same philosophies, and we were sharing some books that we've been reading. You mentioned Rework, which was a book by, I forget, I don't think you mentioned the author, but it's the folks that did created Basecamp. And then I was talking about a book that I just finished called Company of One by Paul Jarvis, who's actually going to be on the podcast later this year. But um, this whole idea of this slow incremental growth, and also not just exploding for the sake of exploding.
Mm.
And yeah, it's
Yeah. No, I'm a big believer in that just because at least for me, I believe that it's better to have a strong foundation that lasts
Mhm.
long term,
Right.
rather than sort of, I mean, it's almost like having a, like a really nice custom house. And when you walk inside, it looks amazing. But if the house is built on a terrible foundation, right, it's not going to last in the long term. So,
Right. Right. Yeah. So to switch gears just a little bit, tell folks a little about more about what you're doing in terms of Healthcasters and some of the e-courses you have and webinars and that sort of thing.
yeah, so I never actually thought that I would end up teaching others
Uh,
how to podcast just because
uh-huh,
I was figuring out a lot of this stuff on my own. I mean, I've probably made most, if not every mistake in the book,
uh-huh.
everything from, forgetting to record an episode all the way to having some sort of like editing snafu. So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
um, basically what happened is, probably about 7, 8 months after I launched my podcast, colleagues started reaching out wanting help with launching their podcasts. And so I just thought, instead of, you know, let's sort of think about this in a bigger scale. What if I just created a community for health and wellness business owners that want to use podcasting as a way to share
mm-hmm.
a message on a bigger scale, but also grow their income? And so that's where Healthcasters came from. And so it's a combination of a couple of different things. It's an e-course. It's also an online community where we support each other on our podcasting journey, ask,
Mm-hmm.
celebrate wins, ask tips, all that kind of stuff. And then it's also, we do monthly coaching calls. So it's an opportunity just to ask questions. And then sometimes we have, for example, other healthcasters on, and they just talk about some of the ways that they're using podcasting to grow their practices or grow their businesses.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's yeah, so why would somebody want to start a podcast if they're maybe in private practice? What's up with that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think for me, I love podcasting because it's a service-based platform, right? We get to share our knowledge and our expertise. And the really neat thing is, it people that are local to where you are hear it, and then people that are in the same state, the same country,
Mhm,
and then all around the world hear it as well. So, for example, with my podcast, the first time I ever launched, my first episode had 9 downloads. And I was telling you, it was Gordon last time, I'm
mhm.
pretty sure like 5 of those downloads were family, but
Yeah.
now it's grown quite a bit. Now it's approaching, I think, 700,000 downloads. It's heard
Wow.
now in 125 countries. But the crazy thing is, I record this in a home office in Philadelphia. And so for private practitioners, I think one of the benefits of podcasting is you get to share your knowledge and expertise, and you get to become an expert in the niche or specialization because you're sharing that through sort of a service-based medium, right?
Right.
It's not
Mhm,
you need to pay me to get this knowledge, but let me do this as a way to serve you and help you.
mhm.
And there's just something very powerful about that when you come from that perspective.
Right. And another thing too, I would add to that is I think it gives people a sense of your personality and who you are
Mhm.
as a therapist as well. And I think that really resonates with people. I know just in listening to your podcast, that's, I knew even before we met, I knew who you were. And
Mhm.
that's, yeah, just kind of and I think that's one of the things that I like about it as well. And I think there's the genuineness of people's personalities come out. I'm sure there are people that are doing podcasts that are more showy, but most of us, I think, tend to be just more conversational and talk about ourselves to some degree, not in a bad way, but I mean, in that sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that is like such like an important aspect to it, because so here's I think for me, what I realized is, for many of us in the field, and probably all of us, right? We have all of this training in terms of clinical training, but then also the ability to ask questions, deepen conversations, redirect conversations, and
Hmm.
all of those different tools are perfect for podcasting. So that's another reason I like it, because it's almost like we already have these superpowers and now we're
Yeah.
just translating them into the podcasting space.
Right, right. Yeah, I remember when I was in graduate school, there was a professor I had that just seemed like he was almost a magician. But I think over time I've realized that's the skill of doing therapy
Mm.
is being able to have those deeper conversations and it, and really kind of make a safe place for people and allow people to be vulnerable. So
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah. So, well, Melvin, I want to be respectful of your time and just, um, and I appreciate the fact that you've come on the podcast. And I've been working at trying to get you here for a while, and we finally got the stars to align in your schedule and my schedule and all of that. And so I'm so glad you joined me today.
Gordon, I'm just so grateful that to be on the podcast. I'm so grateful you reached back out, because
Yeah.
I mean, as I shared just when we were talking, we had a baby. She was a preemie, so like last year has been
Hmm.
absolutely, just focus on being dad. And
Hmm.
but I'm great. I am grateful that our
Yeah.
stars did align. So
Yes. Yes. That's great. So tell folks more about where they can get in touch with you and just more about that. And also maybe just kind of let's finish up on telling folks maybe give them a smidgen of some of your future plans and things coming up for you.
yeah, absolutely. So the best way to find me is on the Selling the Couch blog, which you can find at sellingthecouch.com. And then if you're interested also just in podcasting, if you just go to that main page, there's a whole section there with a ton of free stuff for podcasting, everything from live webinars to pre-recorded webinars to we just finished a free email course on podcasting that you can download there as well.
Mm-hmm.
As far as my future plans, one of the things that I'm now trying to figure out is, what is Selling the Couch going to look like, especially now being a dad, right? When I first started this, it was just my wife and I. And so some of the things that I'm thinking about is, what will private practice look like? We had actually talked about this privately, but I'm considering changing niches just because
Mm-hmm.
I think there's such a huge need in terms of working with immigrant populations who have childhood trauma. And
Mm-hmm.
then in terms of Selling the Couch, the podcast is still growing. Is still growing strong.
Uh-huh.
I'm Healthcasters is continuing to grow. We're over now to record this, so I think 217 podcasters in that
Wow.
community. And then I created the STC directory, which is basically a way for us to be able to connect with one another and build those authentic relationships. And
Yeah.
so right now I'm trying to tweak and figure out what sort of the future iteration of the directory will be
Mm-hmm.
like. But all of that you can find on the Selling the Couch blog.
Yes, and we'll be sure to have links in the show notes and the show summary and everything for all that. So, well, Melvin, let's do this again.
Yeah, no, definitely, Gordon. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for having me on.
yeah, and thanks again for joining me. I've been thrilled to have you. Well, folks, I hope you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have. I'm just so grateful to Melvin for being on the podcast and for joining me. I've been Melvin and I have are of the same mind, and I think you maybe kind of figured that out in the podcast today. And I'm so grateful to Melvin for having me as a guest on the Selling the Couch podcast. I believe that's session number 191 of the Selling the Couch podcast. So you can take a listen to that, where we talk about G Suite, which was just a whole different topic from today. But, one of the things that we talked about that just, I think has resonated with me since I started doing this podcast is just the wealth of knowledge that I can get from other people in this space and just the friendships that I've developed. in just a short period of time. There's something about this medium that just allows you to connect in ways that you wouldn't normally just through the written word. And, I know I started listening to podcasts back in, as I think I mentioned, probably in earnest around 2010 or sometime around there. Well, it was probably before then, but right when kind of podcasting was just starting to take off. And it's just a great way to learn so much. And so maybe consider doing your own podcast in conjunction with your therapy practice. I'm toying with that idea myself. My podcast has mainly been here with the practice of therapy, but I think there's a lot to be said for doing a local podcast that really lets people know who you are as a clinician. So thanks again, Melvin, for being on the podcast. And it's been great to get to know Melvin and foster that friendship as well. So also be sure and check out the Money Matters for Private Practice course while it's in the last weeks of the pre-launch. And so you can get that at half price. And if you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com/finance course, you can get that and use the coupon code TAKE50, just TAKE50. And also check out today's show sponsor, Practice Solutions. They are really a huge help to me in my own practice, and they really know what they're doing when it comes to medical billing and helping you navigate all the things around insurance credentialing and billing, and that whole swamp, as I like to call it. But and I know for a lot of folks, being on insurance panels is really a necessity. And I know that is true for me and my practice, just because of the demographics of the area that I live in. People depend on their insurance. So practicesol.com/Gordon, and talk to the folks over at Practice Solutions. Well, folks, thanks again for joining me on this episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Do take the time to subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it, whether it be on Apple iTunes or on Stitcher or Google Play or iHeartRadio or Spotify or Amazon Echo. We're on there now. Just wherever you might be listening to the podcast, do take the time to subscribe. And also leave us a review. That just helps our ratings. Give us a rating and a review. I really love getting the feedback from people around the podcast. And also, if there's a particular topic you'd like to have covered on the podcast, let me know about it. You can always email me at gordon@practiceoftherapy.com. Take care, folks. Have a good rest of your week or weekend whenever you might be listening to this. Been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.